Professor Preston, when you were preparing to write your presidential address, which was eventually published in Demography for the Population Association of America, what sort of issues were current? What sort of things were you thinking about that led you to write it on the particular subject that you chose?
I think I had gone back over some of the presidential addresses in the past 20 years or so, and those which seemed more successful to me were dealing with current topics and American topics. Now, most of my research at that point had been on developing country demography, and especially mortality, but I thought it would be useful and more interesting to the audience to have something that was focused on the United States. So that was one decision. I guess two things combined to produce the paper's theme. One was that I was director of a population center at the University of Pennsylvania, and a lot of things come across your desk, statistical profiles and whatnot. And I flipped through them, and I began to see a pattern in some of what I was looking at that I thought had not been pointed out. And the pattern was that children on a number of indicators had deteriorating conditions, and the elderly on a number of the same indicators had improving conditions. And poverty was one that had simply not been talked about, I don't believe, at that time. But children's poverty rates were rising and elderly poverty rates were falling, and I thought that would make an interesting theme of a broader discussion. So it was really sort of inductive. It's not hypothesis testing at all. I observed something that was going on and then tried to explain it. It seems to me that's a classic demographer's modus operandi. And I also, in everyone's personal lives, there are circumstances that affect what's going on. I had aging parents, and I was struggling to raise 3 kids, and there's some tension between those roles, and I thought that would be, that was sort of a motivating factor as well. So I proceeded to write a paper that compared the trends in the well-being of the two groups and tried to explain what I thought was going on with some political explanations as well as more classical demographic explanations.
Okay. Concerning the process by which the paper itself was actually written and the research that it's based on is actually done, did you work in close quarters with a lot of other people, say, for example, with graduate students or with other colleagues? What sort of interchanges did you have with other people in the process of creating the work?
Actually, not very many interchanges. It's a topic that there was no one else working on. I mean, it's not that there weren't some people who specialized in children and some others who specialized in the elderly, but actually among neither group were issues of well-being or welfare very prominent at that time. And there was nobody at Penn that I felt that I could talk to about some of these issues, at least. Now, when I did a draft of the paper, I showed it to 6 or 8 colleagues at Penn. Frank Furstenberg and Susan Watkins were particularly helpful in pointing me toward other research and so forth. But the first draft was basically done on my own without input, and it wasn't a very data-intensive paper in the sense that I had to manipulate lots of large data files for which I would typically have used other people. Rather, it was using existing published data, trying to make sense of the patterns that they seem to reveal.
Exactly. Okay. Since that paper was published in Demography and other things along the same line were also published by you, there's been a lot more attention to this kind of issue, and in particular, there are some people in the public or the mass press, you might say, who sometimes take a kind of very simplified view of this, that it's a kind of a contest between old people and children. Now, although you point out very clearly in the article, you're not saying that the old people are taking the bread out of the mouths of babes. Sometimes that gets interpreted that way, and I just wonder what you see as the impact that paper has had, and where you see the debate as having gone since it came out.
Well, the paper did have an impact. It had a much larger impact than all the other papers I've done put together, I think. part of the reason is that I decided to do a more popularized version of it that was published in Scientific American. That was a boiled down version of the argument, and that got a lot of attention. And in fact, I would say within 2 months of the publication of these two articles that came out just about the same time, I was getting a raft of calls every day about the issues that were raised, and the paper was very popular among advocacy groups for children, the Children's Defense Fund and Child Trends and so forth, and it was extremely unpopular among advocacy groups for the elderly, who were eager to perpetuate the myth that the elderly were a very, very disadvantaged group because it was politically expedient for that myth to be out in the public. Now, there are obviously many elderly people who are not very well off, but on average they were doing quite well. The Americans for the AARP, Americans, what is it? The
American Association of Retired
Thank
Persons.
you. The American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, issues a magazine called Modern Maturity, which is the second largest circulation magazine in the country after Reader's Digest. And in an editorial that appeared shortly after my papers, they called me America's leading crusader against the elderly.
Oh my God.
And within a day or two, my parents were on the phone, my wife's parents were on the phone, everybody was calling them saying, what's going on, what is this person doing? Actually, I asked them to reconsider the argument, and they retracted the claim a couple of issues later, but no one ever seems to have seen the claim. But I was on the hit list for elderly lobbyists for 4 or 5 years, I would say, after this appeared. I testified before Congress. I had a number of public appearances that sometimes, I appeared in the American Gerontological Association meetings and with a predictable response. I think, however, the arguments have been accepted, and I'm not the only one who's been making them subsequently. A number of other people have realized that the status of American children has really gone in a direction that we don't as a people want to see. And furthermore, that the elderly as a political lobby are the strongest lobby in the country. And however, it's a lobby that I believe has begun to behave much more responsibly, especially AARP. I mean, I think they've taken very sensible stances on a number of recent issues having to do both with the elderly and with children. So I would like to think I contributed to a debate that had a resolution that was in the common interest. But at the time, I really felt as though I was under siege by people who represented the interests of the elderly. One colleague of mine said that the implication of your article is that there are going to be a lot more older people out there eating dog food. And it's the kind of claim that makes you stop and think. But I believe that as social scientists, our responsibility is to try and understand what's going on and interpret it. And that was my aim, and I hope the political implications are not adverse. But one can never be certain.
You made it quite clear in the Demography article that you were not so much attributing the poor state of America's children to the success of old people in gathering resources, but the things that were happening to them, like divorces of their parents,
Exactly.
and that sort of thing.
And the fact that there was so little state support, central government support for children, that the family was the principal structure that was designed to support children, and the family was having difficulties, which it continues to have, and whereas the elderly were protected from that by virtue of the fact that they were getting such heavy subsidies from the federal government.
What's your reaction or your opinion about many of the studies that have appeared subsequent to that article that look at this from a kind of cross-national perspective and talk about how in some countries levels of support for both children and old people are high, while in other countries, support for both is low, that it's a non-zero sum.
Right. I think those studies, mostly using the Luxembourg Income Dynamics panel data, are extremely useful in revealing the impact of government program and family organization and disorganization on the relative well-being of the two groups. And they show that children in the United States are the worst off of children in any developed country of the 12 or 14 that have been investigated, in terms of economic circumstances at least. The elderly are about in the middle of the pack, and elderly married people do very, very well. It's elderly widows and very old widows in particular where the U.S. begins to fall behind other Western countries. But I think they've helped show that the U.S. has a particularly deadly combination of lack of support at the governmental level for children, and a family system that is more disorganized than any other countries, except for Sweden. But Sweden protects its children through income maintenance programs. The United States has both weak families and weak government programs, and the result is that a very high fraction of kids are growing up in poverty.